which is this handy document prepared by a smart SciSc grad. He was a math major at Harvard, linear equations, etc. That will be very useful over the course of this class. And secondly, preview chapters 3 and 4 in your textbook, because that will lay the bulk of the groundwork for lectures 3 and 4. Okay, so just skim it, look through it. Whenever you see a fancy equation or something, look it up. If you don't understand it, that's okay, because we'll go over it on Tuesday. Okay. Any other questions on math and that type of thing? No? You guys are cool? All right. So what I want to do today is, unfortunately, the nature of this topic requires us to get a couple terms and definitions out of the way. So that's what a bulk of today is about. We're going to talk about the problems of measuring economic growth, what economic growth is, some of the main concepts and patterns that we've observed over the past 2,000 years with regards to economic growth. Specifically, we're going to talk about different measures of economic growth, the difference between GDP and GNP, and also issues of comparison across countries, namely that of purchasing power parity. Okay? From there, we're going to take a long-term view of economic development and describe some statistics about human development since 1 AD to the present. And then I'm going to talk about two alternatives to GDP. One is the Human Development Index, and the other are the Millennium Development Goals. You guys might remember the Millennium Development Goals because we talked about those on Tuesday. And I passed out a handy sheet, and I have extra copies of that when we go over it. Okay? Next, we ask the question, is economic growth desirable? This is something that we generally assume to be the case, that people want to be richer, and that societies in general over time want to earn more money per capita. But there we have a decent amount of data about the links between economic growth and things like happiness. And the link, surprisingly, is somewhat tenuous past a certain point. So I want to put that out there and discuss it. We'll take a brief break thereafter, and then we'll jump into some of the groundwork of economic growth, of mathematical representation of economic growth. We will talk about factor accumulation and productivity growth. Factor accumulation being the deepening of a country's capital stock, and productivity growth referring to the efficiency of the means of production in a given economy. Then we will give you the sources of growth analysis. We're going to talk about a concept known as total factor productivity, which is highly related to economic growth. Issue 7, we're going to talk about 5 characteristics of rapidly growing economies or rapidly growing countries. 8, we're going to talk about diminishing returns. I mean, you guys have heard that concept, diminishing returns. Okay, mostly everybody, right? This is a core concept in microeconomics, and it's one that that lays the groundwork for many of the growth theories we're going to learn about in this course. And finally, we'll talk about convergence, which I'm assuming you guys have heard of, is a theory. Okay, so convergence is the notion that in the long run, a long enough timeline, advanced countries' GDP growth rates per capita will converge to some common level, and their income per capita will converge to some common level as well. And finally, we'll end it on growth and structural change, and we'll talk about what will the further growth chapters in lectures 3 and lecture 4. Okay. So that said, let's just jump right into it. Measuring economic growth. Well, last week we talked about the difference between growth and development. Growth, which is of course both in terms of national income which we'll refer to as Y, income, aggregate income, and also income per person or per capita, Y over L, which will also denote with a lowercase cursive y. Both of these are positive concepts. What do I mean by positive concepts? Well, they relate to truth as such. There is no value judgment associated with telling you that the per capita GDP of XYZ country is $3,000 a person. Okay? As economists and as developmental theorists, we try to deal in the realm of positive economics. The difference, of course, being that there is a separate concept of development. Development is inherently normative. Why is that? Well, there's far less consensus on what constitutes development. We have certain metrics by which we measure development: life expectancy, income per capita, access to clean water, etc. And yet, it's very difficult to define it in any meaningful way on which everybody agrees. Many of the hyper-poor of the world would look at the living standards of the poorest citizens of America and claim that they live like kings. And yet, we're acutely aware of the discourse in this country about economic inequality and the level of the living standards that we assume people have a right to attain. So, that said, we're going to come up with a couple metrics in order to quantify these two things that we'll talk about in a bit. But it's important first to denote, GDP and GNP. Fundamentally, these are the two most important national accounts we deal with. Now, anybody know the difference between GDP and GNP? Anybody do the reading, remember? Yeah, anybody? Yep.
Well, according to the book,
it's a good source.
GDP is the output produced within a country's borders,
Good.
Even if some of that output is produced by people that aren't citizens of that country.
Very
whereas
good.
The other one would include output by those from that country who live abroad.
Yeah, exactly. National. Very good. So GDP, gross domestic product, think of borders. Right? All the economic activity that takes place within a territorially defined area. That's GDP. GNP refers to passports. Is the total amount of economic value created by the nationals of a given country, of a given state. Now, why do we care about the difference between these two things? Is it just arbitrary? Yeah?
It matters when it comes to multinational corporations, like how to calculate profits for a company like IBM.
Sure, definitely. That's very relevant. Now, what about the factors of production? The biggest expense for businesses tends to be labor. So how might it relate to that? You want to take another stab at it, or anybody?
Well, obviously the country, the GDP matters for the country itself.
Mm-hmm.
How the economy, particular economy, how powerful or how strong they are,
Mm-hmm.
versus the nationals that live in other economies.
Sure. Now, exactly, that's it. And so, related to that concept is this notion that many countries, especially many developing countries, have very large migrant populations. Okay, think places like the Philippines, El Salvador. These countries send lots of their citizens and have them work abroad. The reason why GMP is a better metric for places that have lots of remitted earnings, is because those earnings ultimately are used to improve the welfare of those inhabitants that are associated with that country and also those who live there. Okay? So be aware of this. Now, for the United States, this isn't that much of a problem. But for a place like El Salvador, Guatemala, El Salvador's GDP, about 17% of it comes from, about 17% of Salvadorian GDP is remittances. I mean, think about that. That's an enormous percentage. Okay? So that's the difference between the two. Now, there are ways to calculate GDP, and so we have a difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. Now, the main difference between real GDP and nominal GDP is that nominal GDP doesn't adjust for inflation. In other words, real GDP adjusts for inflation. Now, the best way to conceptualize this is through an equation. So, the way we calculate the nominal GDP of a given territory, okay? We simply take the price of a good that particular year, okay? PTI, right? I being just whatever good it is, okay? And multiply it by the quantity of that good produced in that same year. So, in a two good, two price economy, we would take each good, multiply the total quantity produced of that good in a given year, multiply it by its price in that year, take the sum of that, and that would give us nominal GDP. So in the case of the United States, for 2010 GDP, we take the total quantity of cars produced in the United States in 2010, multiplied by the average price of cars in 2010, and that gives us the car component. Now, that would be fine in terms of measuring living standards if there were no change in price overall in the economy. If prices were constant over time, there would be no difference between nominal and real GDP, based purely on price. So, the way we calculate real GDP is to use some base year level of prices. So just like our equation with nominal GDP, we're still taking the quantities produced in the year we care about. Okay? Cars produced in 2010. But we take the price of some base year, maybe 2000 or 1990, in order to strip away the effect of the increase in price over time and merely focus on the change in value added based on quantity. Question?
So that base year is an average of the prices that year? How do you come?
Yeah, that depends. So oftentimes what you'll take for your base year, you'll use the same base year for every good. Okay, so you'll say the price of toilet paper in 1990, the price of car in 1990, etc. In which base year you pick, that's arbitrary.
Right. Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that I understand how you, because it's the same problem, that over time that year the price changed. It varied.
Oh, that particular year?
Right.
Oh, yeah. Then I think, you'd probably just take, the average price for that year. Maybe the end of year price for that year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you just pick a number out of that year.
Exactly.
Okay.
It depends. I mean, that's a methodology thing beyond the scope of this particular thing. Cool. So, any questions on these equations? Okay. So, we care about GDP largely because individual countries benefit greatly from how much they contribute to the actual process of production worldwide. What I mean by that is this concept of value added. So in the GDP accounting sense, what is value added? Jürgen?
Basically, a particular sector, industry sector, what that contributes to GDP.
So that's definitely a part of it. So you can decompose GDP into saying that, in 2007, 30% of U.S. GDP came from financial services. That's definitely accurate. But I'm thinking more along the chain of production. Yes, Win?
Is it like the amount of the final price that each stage of production adds?
Very good. Yeah, so that's absolutely it. So we have something known as the value chain. And that's the notion that, I mean, take the average MP3 player. Let's just say an iPod, right? Now, an iPod is created first by getting a lot of raw materials together, raw plastics, silicon, taking those, fabricating them into chips and screens and buttons. Then those buttons and all that's put together into a final product. And then that final product is shipped for distribution and sold. Right? That's the life cycle of an iPod. Now, the price Apple pays in parts and labor to create an iPod is only about $100. And the average iPod sells for about $200. So, the reason why value added makes sense and is important for development is because where you are on the value chain can determine how much money you make from the production of things. Only about $7 of every $200 iPod comes from labor. Think about that. So would you rather invent the next big thing or manufacture the next big thing? That's kind of an active debate going on right now in the economics literature. And that's why, as we'll see, innovation is so important in driving income growth over time in advanced countries. It's because being at the high end of the value chain is far more lucrative than being at the low end of the value chain. And as countries develop, we expect them to rise up the value chain. Make sense? Cool. All right. So that's the difference between GDP, GNP, and the whole concept of value added.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Or should I leave it for later?
Well, it depends on the...
Talking about GDP. Well, today I read the article. It's that syndicate project that works.
Project
basically
Syndicate?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they compare the GDP of China versus the U.S., saying that Chinese GDP will surpass
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. in a couple of years. So
Sure.
then, but we all know now, coming from this, that innovation happens here.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mostly happen in China. So
Sure.
how do they compare these two?
Sure. Well, the issue is, we'll talk about the concept of catch-up, but what the basis of the IMF report that I'm assuming this article is based on.
I guess.
For those of you who haven't read about it, the IMF came out a couple weeks ago and said that Chinese GDP is set to surpass U.S. GDP by 2016. Okay, and yeah, you're right. The nature of the article is that China's population is so much larger than the United States, and even if their per capita income is about a quarter of the United States, their GDP could theoretically match ours. So that process of catching up, quote unquote, not on per capita terms now, but simply matching the U.S.'s total GDP, is largely due to capital accumulation, and not as much has to do with innovation as such. But the challenge for China is whether or not they can rise up the value chain once they hit the middle income area and actually be an innovation economy once labor costs rise. And that's anybody's best guess. Okay? We'll spend some time talking about that later in the course. Yes?
So, does that mean that the economic news about the U.S. is artificially dire because GDP undercounts the value of stuff like this?
That's a great question, and it depends on who you ask. So you'll have some macroeconomists who claim that the debt overhang of 30 years of binge borrowing, right, since basically 1980 to 2007, will keep the U.S. mired in recession with high unemployment and low growth for the next 15 years. That's one point of view, and there's some truth to that. Other slightly more optimistic economists say the institutions of innovation in the United States, our research universities, entrepreneurship, the culture of entrepreneurship, our supply of entrepreneurs, our patent regime, all the things that create innovation are actually still quite strong. And that's kind of our get out of jail free card, that if we can innovate ourselves out of this mess, that somehow makes the predictions slightly more rosy. It really depends on who you ask, though, but those are kind of the two camps. Okay? Yeah, Sam?
So what countries would you say have sort of successfully moved up the value chain?
That's a good question. I think a good example of this might be Korea. When they first started, they were largely agricultural based and low-end textile based. Today, Korea has a vibrant, they are the single biggest producer of ships, large ships. Their conglomerates make many high-end manufacturing goods like cars. Think of Hyundai and Kia as examples of this. They do ports. I think they won a fairly large deal with the UAE. So this is a country that 40 years ago was considered economic backwater, that today is quote unquote risen up the value chain. So it's possible, but over the course of this class, we're going to talk about why so many countries can't do that. And I think Korea is an example of one of the handful of success cases. Also, the United States rose up the value chain. We caught up quite a bit over the 19th century and eventually became an innovation economy in the 20th. Okay. Good, all good questions. So, moving on, I want to talk about economic growth now, issue number 2, in economic development in the long-term view. Now, as you read in Amartya Sen's piece, growth is a necessary but not sufficient condition for development. Okay? Now, why is that? Well, if we consider economic development is some semblance of poverty reduction, well, poverty reduction can take place in one of two ways. It can either take place by creating a larger pie or growing national income, but poverty reduction can also take place through redistribution, by confiscating gains from the higher ends of the income brackets and passing them on to the lower ends of the income brackets. Development can take place with two means. Now, what combination of the two you prefer, that's a normative thing. What's important is that most economists agree you need some of both. It's important to grow the pie, but it's also important to make sure that the growing pie lifts all ships. Now, more specifically, there are 3 reasons why growth is insufficient for development as such. 3 reasons why it could be the case. The first reason why economic growth might not facilitate development is the concept that governments can promote growth for bad reasons. They might promote growth for the power and glory of the state and its rulers. They might promote growth to benefit a minority of the ruling class. Think of economic growth in Saudi Arabia as an example of this. Secondly, even if an economy is growing vibrantly, even if they achieve vibrant growth, resources could still be invested in further growth, such that consumption gains never take place. So, can anybody think of an example of a very rapidly growing country with a fairly depressed consumption base? Yeah, Sam? China's a great example of this. Okay? Now, this again comes down to your value judgment, but perhaps some degree of deferring your growth and deferring consumption is necessary for economic growth. But what's the point of deferring ad infinitum? So each country reaches a point where they really should start enjoying present consumption. When we reach that point is unclear, but that particular dynamic is very important for development. And the third problem is, of course, distribution. It's possible to have rich-friendly growth that doesn't raise the living standards of lower rungs of society. Latin America during the 20th century is a good example of this, in many cases. So as Dr. Sen points out, income in and of itself is simply a means to an end and not an end in and of itself. And so he proposes a broad definition of development and a broad goal of development, which is to expand the capabilities of people to live the lives they choose to lead. Sen's ultimate goal of development is to expand the capabilities of people to live the lives they choose to lead. In other words, expand people's ability to choose increase the frequency, the magnitude, and the number of potential choices they can make. This is something known as economic freedom. Economic freedom to choose. Now specifically, Sen identifies 4 additional factors that we need to look at when talking about economic growth and economic development. The first is something he calls personal heterogeneities. Things like age, proneness to illness, extent of disabilities, etc. Right? The degree to which individual outcomes vary within a specific economy is important. The second factor he talks about is environmental diversity. The third is variation in social climate. Variation in social climate. It's possible to have a country growing at 15% per capita year over year, yet still discriminate against half their population without gender rights. And finally, differences in relative deprivation is another important factor of something that development ought to alleviate. So to conclude this, Sen claims that the real goal of economic development then requires alleviating the sources of something he calls capability deprivation that prevents people from having the freedom to live the lives that they desire. I'll put that term on the board.
I'm sorry, can you also just repeat those 4 really quickly?
Absolutely.
Just bullet.
Yep. So the 4 are personal heterogeneities, environmental diversities, variations in social climate, and differences in relative deprivation. And his conclusion again is that economic development requires us to alleviate capability deprivation. If you haven't yet, I strongly urge you to take a look at the selected chapter by Sen. Now that we have this kind of a broad-based understanding of economic development informed by Sen, it's important to consider economic development over the long term. Now, on Tuesday, I talked about how economic development as we know it today is a relatively new phenomenon. Now, there's an economist by Angus Madison who argued that who actually tried to trace economic growth rates as far back as 1 AD. And this is what he found. He found that growth from year 0 to year 1000 was effectively 0 on a per capita basis. Until 1820, he reasoned, world income per capita grew at a paltry rate of about half a percentage point. It was only after 1820 that economic growth really took off. But moreover, not only is the growth today relatively unprecedented by historical standards, but growth also tends to exacerbate inter-country inequality. The ratio of the average income in the richest regions to those in the poorest regions was about 3 to 1 in 1820. So the richest countries had about 3 times the wealth per capita as the poorest countries in about 1820. That's still quite significant and allowed them to continue to lay the groundwork of global colonialism. Yet by 1950, this ratio had risen to 15 to 1. So it's clear that economic growth tended to exacerbate interregional, intercountry inequality. Now, that's important to note, but remember that the poorest regions still benefited slightly from this economic growth. So even if their paths diverged from a multiple standpoint, many poor countries still grew or saw rising living standards over this period. Moreover, between 1950 and 2008, patterns of growth changed in many regions. Asia tended to join the growing masses, as did some countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe as well, while sub-Saharan Africa stagnated. As a result, the income gap between even Western offshoots like Korea grew to about 18 to 1 when compared to sub-Saharan Africa. So it wasn't just growth in the West, but there are several new players in Asia, in Latin America, that also joined this growth spurt. Now this is something talked about by Sachs in the article we assigned. Okay, Sachs spends some time talking about how there's kind of two paths that poor countries have taken. One is a path of relative deprivation and stagnation. And he also talks about the world that has climbed onto the growth path. Read that chapter with an eye to that point, and it'll make it a little clearer. Now, one final note on this particular topic. There's an economist named Alexander Gerkenström who talked about the advantages of relative backwardness. And he claimed that it's possible for countries to catch up very quickly with the spread and diffusion of technology across borders. This concept of catch-up is very important.
What was the economist again?
I'll raise name on board. Can you see this?
Is there evidence that he's right?
Definitely. I mean, certain countries are able to grow quite quickly in a very, very protracted period of time, right? And achieve per capita income growth rates that took other countries maybe 4 times that amount of time. So catch-up is possible. But I think his point, obviously, just kind of, it begets the question, why is it that some countries do catch up while others don't? And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that question in this class. Okay? So that concludes issue 2. Are there any questions on that? Yes?
Did we skip over purchasing power parity? B, 1B.
Student problems of purchasing power parity? Yes, we did.
Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Thank you for reminding me. So, purchasing power parity. Sorry about that, guys. Got space in the margins? Okay. So there is some need for common currency in comparing living standards across countries. Okay? Now, anybody who's traveled to the developing world knows that $1 there goes much further than $1 here. And this is because there are some goods that simply aren't traded in international markets. Things like haircuts, internal transportation, wholesale and retail services, restaurants and hotels, elementary school education, etc. There are many goods that are produced and consumed internally in an economy that aren't traded across borders. So the problem is that exchange rates do not reflect the relative prices of non-tradables. And so our solution to this is purchasing power parity, which attempts to create international benchmarks such that a cement block or a haircut is assigned the same value no matter if it's produced in New York City or Beijing. And there was actually a 1968 UN comparison program that attempted to derive a set of international prices in some type of common currency. And this makes sense because, based purely on market exchange rates, we would assume that the United States GDP is about 75 times that of India's. Yet based on purchasing power parity, it's a much more modest 14 times. Okay? Any questions on that? Yeah, Wayne.
What kind of problems or limitations are there with GDP? For example, I know that the report you were talking about with China taking over the U.S., a lot of people say that it's like an inflated perception because it's done on purchasing power parity. What kind of limitations are there?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I guess the first is the issue. There's an issue of trying to create a world price for some good when domestic preferences might be completely different. And this is a problem that we talk about in international trade all the time. It's that, let's say, just to say stereotype, Indian demand for Bollywood movies is far higher than world demand for Bollywood movies, such that the purchasing power parity price might not reflect that. So there's different competitive dynamics inside of countries that purchasing power parity just can't back out. And that's a limitation of it. Okay? Good question. Anybody else? Yeah, you're good.
I have a question. Isn't it the motivation of people to go to those countries to exactly make use of that higher value of the dollar, and that's the reason it contributes to their GDP?
Oh yeah.
So, isn't that one of the motivations why the GDP is actually bigger, because people from abroad go there to do certain things?
That's absolutely true, and that's there's two kind of responses to that. The first is those tend to be in the tradable realm of taking advantage of the lower price in some other country, and two, transaction costs. Okay, even if haircuts are only $6 in Beijing, and I spend $20 for a mediocre haircut in DuPont Circle, there's still it's not feasible to consider that price difference ever being arbitraged away because of transnational migration flows. So what you're saying makes sense for things that are uniform goods produced in many places, and that's why have you heard of the Big Mac Index that's created by the Economist magazine? So what they try to do is take market exchange rates and basically determine whether or not countries' exchange rates are overvalued or undervalued based on the purchasing power of a Big Mac, because they're produced in so many different places. So you would expect those price differences to be arbitraged away in the way you're describing. But for some goods, that's strictly impossible.
And what about the differences of prices within the country?
Oh, you mean like intra-country? Yeah, that's also somewhat problematic. Oftentimes, it's a weighted average based on total number of people in certain areas, but it's an imperfect science for that reason. Also, when we talk about trade, we often talk about countries trading with one another, but very large countries tend to trade internally as well, such that in a long enough timeline, those internal price differences will also get arbitraged largely away. Yep. See a couple of hands. Yeah, please. Whoever.
I believe there's also an element of speculation, and it also depends on the volume of currency or currency you have within the country. I mean, from the experience I have within a developing country, usually there's a black market for the foreign exchange, for the risk of the dollar, and from the the empirical evidence suggests that this is usually based on the pure volume of the actual currency that you have in the country that will pretty much play the exchange rate.
For the nominal exchange rate. Okay, fair enough.
I mean, it has nothing to do with the haircut price or the price of the £1 for
Yeah.
for beef or whatever was on the market. Usually it has to do with the actual volume of the foreign currency. In the case of my country, the US dollar on the market that you actually have in hands.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely determined of market exchange rates. Real exchange rates are another matter. Okay, as you know, those take into account actual differences in aggregate price levels. Yeah.
This was a comment, but I have a question just to summarize on the understanding of the purchasing power.
Yeah.
When you said that the exchange rate did not reflect the real prices of non-tradables, that's actually the purchasing power?
So that's when we say exchange rates, if we were to take India's GDP, convert it into rupees, convert it into dollars at market exchange rates, that figure you get doesn't reflect the fact that non-tradables relative cheapness in India is understated. Does it make sense? Yeah, question.
Does the purchasing power parity apply to just the non-tradables goods and services, or to all goods and services, even the ones that have a market value?
It tends to have the biggest impact on non-tradables. And yet, this UN project tried to treat all goods more or less in the same way. Okay? Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like the distortion on a haircut is far different from the distortion on a Big Mac. Right. Cool. So let's move along. On issue 3, I want to talk very briefly on a couple alternatives to GDP. And in order to understand the limitations of GDP, I want to read you a quote by Bobby Kennedy. I think this really captures the limits of trying to create and figure out a country's standard of living based purely on GDP. So he continues. He says, "Too much and too long, we seem to have surrendered community excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product, if we should judge America by that, counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for those who break them. It counts destruction of our redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm and the cost of nuclear warhead, and armored cars for police who fight riots in our streets. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife in the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of our education, or the joy in their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or lack thereof, that's my editorializing, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it tells us everything about America except why we are proud of that we are Americans." And I think if we consider for a second the fact that so much of life just can't be quantified in numbers, that quote has some resonance. And so economists are acutely aware of this particular problem, and as such have created certain other metrics that we'll talk about briefly now. The first of which is the Human Development Index. Would you be so kind? Thank you. Collective action problem? All right. So the Human Development Index, everybody good? Keep it going. So what I've photocopied for you now is the 2010 Human Development Index, and this in particular is good because it talks about the different components of the Human Development Index. So we have life expectancy at birth, mean years of schooling. What I'm doing now is talking about the column headings on page 1. Expected years of schooling, gross national income per capita, and then they give you some the difference between the two to show you that gross national income doesn't necessarily correlate with what they deem as human development. Now, it's interesting to note that many of the countries here are located in the West, but I point you towards Korea as an example of a country who, if there were a Human Development Index 40 years ago, likely wouldn't rank in the top 15, let alone the top 40. Okay? This is an alternative to GDP. And also, we have the Millennium Development Goals. We talked about this at great length on Tuesday, so I don't want to overwhelm you with it. But if you have any questions during the break, I can pass out the sheet with them on them. Those are two broad alternatives to GDP. Neither has made particularly strong inroads yet into replacing GDP, but they're there. Okay?
Is HDI not the World Bank, is it the UN?
Yeah. Okay. Now, finally, before our break, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about whether or not economic growth is desirable. Okay. Now, critics of economic growth, or critics of the project of trying to create more economic growth in less developed countries, claims that economic growth accompanies a spread of materialism across borders. It is often accompanied by a westernization of world cultures, a destruction of traditional societies, environmental degradation, such as global warming and a loss of endangered species. So they claim that there are all these things, these negative externalities to economic growth. Furthermore, the critics of growth claim that GDP and happiness are largely uncorrelated past a certain point. This is true across countries, and it's also true inside of countries based on incomes. Economists have found that in the United States, for example, if your income rises above $50,000 a year in a single-family household, the gains to aggregate happiness are relatively mild. And your book has a nice chart comparing different countries and different happiness levels that I urge you to take a look at. Now that said, I think we can argue very clearly that economic growth, in particular a strong economic growth rate, confers certain advantages. They increase the range of human choice, as we talked about. And also it gives man more control over his environment, thereby increasing his freedom. Now, I want to show you a brief proof as to why economic growth is so important. And I want you to consider the difference between a growth rate of 1% and a growth rate of 2%. It's a nice little parlor trick you can bust out. Yep.
It's hard to see.
Oh, it's hard to see over there?
There's glare from that window.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. No, I can put it over here. Thank you for letting me know. So the question is, why do we care if a country's growth rate is 1% or 2% if it accompanies all of these costs? Well, in order to figure this out, we can borrow a simple equation. A is equal to the total amount of accumulation after T years. Okay? Accumulation after T years. P is your principal, or some amount invested in the first period. and R is some rate. In this case, we're going to say it's some growth rate. Okay. Have you guys seen this equation before? No? Okay. Well, you'll see it in action now, and then you can calculate how much you might earn with the certificate of deposit at today's low interest rates. That would be a good example for you. Okay. So the question is, based on different growth rates, how long will it take income to double? Well, we can actually use this equation. We can claim that if our period 1 income is P, and we want to double period 1 income, we can figure out how many years at a certain growth rate it will take to double income. So we can substitute this in. This is step 1, step 2, e to the RT. Of course, now the p's cancel out, and we're left with 2 equals e to the RT. Okay. So now the question is, how long will it take income to double? Anybody know what we should do at this step? Anybody read the Math Companion and see how to solve algebraic equations with variables in the exponent? Yeah, very good. Natural. Did you say national log or
natural log?
Natural log.
Years. Which is, yeah, rule of 72, just work with it.
Yeah, well, it's important to show it.
Yes.
So we'll take the natural log of both sides. And recalling your log rules from the Math Companion, the exponent of log, what happens to that? Anybody? So the exponent of log becomes the coefficient. You guys see that? You see step 4 to step 5, we brought down r times t, right? That's the benefit of doing logs, right? We can bring the exponent down. Okay? And further, we know that the natural log of e is 1. So we can say that the natural log of 2 equals r times t. And after class, we can talk about why the natural log of e is 1 if you have any questions on that. And so the natural log of 2, plugging it into a calculator, is 0.693, which divided by r tells us how long it will take to double income. T being time, how long it will take. So this is why growth rates matter. If we have a growth rate of 1%, plugging into our new equation, it'll take approximately 70 years for income to double. A growth rate of 2% will take about 35 years. So minor changes in growth rates can have very large reverberating effects on aggregate income over time. That's why we care about growth. Okay? Sorry, is that in the glare territory? I'll repeat. 1% growth, plugging that in, right? 0.01, 0.693 divided by 0.01 equals approximately 70. And 2% growth, about 35. Hence the rule of 70. So don't worry, we're not going to ask you to replicate this on a test or anything, but if you ever want to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation of how long it will take something to double, take 70 divided by the growth rate, and that's how long it will take to double. And now you know why. Voila. Okay. Cool. So keep in mind that that's why economic growth is desirable. Minute changes in different growth rates can change welfare impact, have great welfare impacts over time. So, great, that's it for the first half of the lecture. Why don't we take a 9-minute break or a 7-minute break and come back at 7:05 and start with factor accumulation and productivity growth. All right? video camera.
I might have to do that.
Okay, yeah. If you have like something recorded, like a little handheld thing. If you did, I can do it on my own. Yeah, like theoretically there is, but I can just send me an email and then I can forward it to tech and make sure that they get there. Okay? Yeah. So no, don't worry about it. Okay. Yeah, Hannah, questions? Move your well, why, you know you can move it to the rest of the building. Yeah, after you think you're good. Yeah, just go do that. Do you know where to get right there? Exactly, I'm 17. Okay. Where are you parking now, right? Yeah, just try, take it, go downstairs.
So I didn't have snacks.
It's right after.
You brought it?
Narrow alley, but.
That's unhealthy,
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, don't worry, I just need a glass of water.
I went around for a good 10 minutes before I couldn't remember.
He is,
Something.
it's like this, it's 2.718.
That's from going to like secrets. In
It's
the
like
vicinity you're talking about?
important number to contact.
It's like a little bit down the block.
You're welcome.
There's a little cafe adjacent to the others.
Yeah, that's what she was just telling me, is down seven.
Down Mass on the left.
Yeah.
Right after the light.
I was on 16th wandering.
There's a Starbucks that way.
No difference?
No, I think it's different enough, I need to buy an hour, actually.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on reserve in the library too.
Sorry. Yeah, it's got different offers. Just click the wrong thing on Amazon.
You can sell it back on half, I think.
That's true.
It's been a little too long since I've had to do that, but I think you can sell it back.
That's possible. I probably won't do it, but.
I just got mine off Amazon, and I think I got a pretty good deal on it. So, let them know. I think so. It's 2 weeks ago. I had to get it, I didn't really care. Yeah, I think so.
Everybody get this?
Just a question, since you just mentioned happiness and economic growth, is there a correlation between economic growth and depression?
I haven't I'm not aware of any particular study.
Because you have a lot of winners, but you also have a lot of losers.
Yeah, so that's there's a branch of behavioral economics that focuses on something known as positional economics. So where they found that, for instance, you don't care about absolute levels of deprivation as much as differences in relative deprivation relative to your peer group. So for instance, even if you're making $150,000 a year, if all your peers are making $180,000 a year, you're more upset by that than if you were to make 100 and everybody else were to make 80. So there's been some research done on that. Yeah, I can send me an email. I can definitely dig those up and send them to you if you're curious. Does economic growth depress you?
Well, I don't know, not me, but...
I think a good current example of that is that guy Gupta, who was on the board of Goldman Sachs, that got implicated in the galleon controversy. He was a multimillionaire, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted to be a billionaire.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, all of his major clients were hedge fund managers and everything. Yeah.
I remember I read this book on the science of happiness, and there was a cartoon, and there was a guy going to his boss. He said, "Boss, if I can't have a raise, could you cut the salary of my colleague?"
That's good. That's funny. Yeah, I found one of my dad's coworkers went to Harvard Business School with Gupta, and he said that he was one of the smartest people he'd ever met. This guy's very, very accomplished. And he said he would just at Harvard he would finish all of his work at like 5 p.m. watching TV for like 6 hours. And he was a Baker Scholar, top 5% there. So he just had one of those keen intellects, and then got greedy at the end of his career. Pretty sad because he really tarnished McKinsey in its own name. But yeah, anyway, all interesting things. So on a lighter note, let's talk about why countries are rich and why countries are poor. So in issue 5, factor accumulation and productivity growth. Now this is predominantly based on chapter 3 of your book. So give this a look-see if what I'm saying is completely foreign to you. So at the core of most theories on economic growth is a relationship between the various factors of production. Be it capital, labor, and in turn total economic production. Now, we know that income, Y, is a function of many things. So as I said before, capital is a large component of this. The capital stock, think heavy machinery, factories, okay? Also, a country's total labor force, right? Capital needs labor to work on it in order to make it productive. Right? The computer is only as productive as the person, manipulating the spreadsheet for it or whatever, programming on it. Also, a major component of this is T, or land. Land is a determinant of income. Things like natural resources determine a country's income. Peace with neighbors and inside of the country determines national income. Stable borders. Innovation, etc. Okay? So there are many, many, many things and many different reasons why countries develop. We, for the sake of simplicity, take the first two factors. Say income is a function of capital and labor. Before I go on, is the glare still bothering you guys? Far around? Medium? Okay, I'm just going to put down the blinds. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I try to keep it lively, and thus figured the natural light would be good. Oh, is that your bag? Is that somebody's bag? I don't want to touch it. There you go. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, no worries. All right. So we claim that a country's output is determined largely by these two factors. And so, we further claim that we don't care about a country's aggregate income so much as we care about their per capita income. And so we manipulate this equation by dividing income by the total number of people inside of the society. So this aggregate production function becomes a per capita production function of little y is a function of little k. Little k being capital per worker or capital per capita. Little y is income per capita. Now, critical to all analysis of economic growth is the idea that capital accumulation per capita leads to income growth. Okay? So accumulating capital per capita leads to income growth, with an important caveat. That caveat being diminishing marginal returns to capital accumulation. Okay. So, we can graph this relationship like so. Now, the graph I'm about to put on the board, you are going to see a lot of on Tuesday. So get used to it. And it looks something like this. Now, what do we mean by factor accumulation? Factor accumulation is this notion that as we increase capital stock per capita, income rises. Yet income rises at a diminishing rate, such that equal incremental increases in capital, say this is 20 and this is 40, yield ever falling amounts of incremental output. Do you guys see that? As we double our capital stock from 20 to 40, okay, those first 20 units of capital per capita drastically increased income. Okay, this entire unit A increased. But as we go from 20 to 40, our incremental increases are even less. Such that out here, we're adding very, very little to income. Okay? Factor accumulation assumes that positive increases in capital lead to positive increases in Y. Okay? So anytime we use the term factor accumulation, that's what we're talking about. Make sense? Yes. Okay. Now further, we also have something known as productivity gains. Now I want you to be aware, as I said before, that there are two sources of economic growth, okay, in this simplified model. The first is accumulation. That's this process, okay? Accumulating capital per capita and thus growing income. The other is the efficiency, increases in the efficiency of the factors of production. That's known as productivity growth. Such that a given amount of capital per labor produces more output than before. We have a way of showing this graphically. An upward shift in the production function is the equivalent of an increase in productivity growth. Okay? Those are the two sources of economic growth. One, accumulation, and two, increasing the efficiency of our capital stock. Now, tell me, where along this curve is accumulation most potent? Early on, when you're very poor and have no capital stock. Very good. So when do you think an economy needs to have efficiency gains in order to continue growing? Naturally, further out here. So this is kind of the mathematical way of talking about the whole value chain analysis, right? As you start off at lower income, it's possible to simply accumulate capital to grow very, very quickly. Yet eventually diminishing returns set in, and you must rely on increases in total factor productivity to drive per capita income growth. That is the assumption of every growth model you're going to learn in this class for the next 2 days. Okay? Any questions on the difference between factor accumulation and productivity gains? Now, we assume, yeah, Win.
I'm just kind of, I mean, I feel like I get it conceptually, but kind of trying to picture it. So, I mean, factor accumulation, you're just getting like more factories and
Yep.
like technological improvement. You're getting like better factories, right?
Yeah, more factories, and then you can think of it, the efficiency of your factories and workers is greater. So, think of a printer. A printer can output. You can either double your number of printers, go from 2 to 4, excuse me, or each individual printer can have greater output per minute of pages. That greater output per minute is the equivalent of a productivity gain.
So I guess my question then is, it seems like the technology. It seems that like the technology is increasing the capital in the same way that like just increasing capital would. But with like smaller numbers, right? That like one printer now is what 10 printers.
Exactly,
were, right?
exactly. That's true. We assume that that's the case, and when we get to the notation of Solow, you'll see why that's the case. But yeah, you're on the right track. Cool, good question. So central is this into growth then is this process of capital accumulation. So now we have to ask, where does accumulation come from? And accumulation comes from investment. Investment in an economy leads to increases in the capital stock of an economy. Now, in order to show you this, let's take a relatively simple example. Have you guys ever seen this before? Yep. So this is a macroeconomics concept. So if you've never seen it, I'll explain it briefly, and I can give you more if you want to read about it. But it's the notion that income in an economy always equals expenditure in an economy. Y being income, and all these things being expenditure. Okay? We have consumption, C, investment, I, government expenditure, G, and net exports, exports minus imports, EX minus IM. Okay? Investments are imports are a leakage from GDP. Okay? So, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that we are in a closed economy. Okay? And let's further assume that we are in a libertarian dream world with no government whatsoever. Okay? So we can say that income minus consumption now equals investment. Now this is true at a national level, but it's also true at a personal level. Why is that? Well, think about it this way. Every dollar of your income that you don't spend, you save. So we can claim that the left-hand side of this equation is savings, such that in a closed economy, all savings comes from investment. All investment comes from savings, and vice versa. Savings equals investment in a closed economy. Savings equals investment in the world economy, because the world is a closed economy. We do not trade with Mars. Okay? Not yet. Somebody said not yet. Okay. So, savings always comes from current income. So deferring current income into savings leads to investment, which leads to accumulation. That is absolutely central to understanding all the growth models. Deferred consumption leads to savings. Deferred consumption leads to savings, which leads to investment, which leads to capital accumulation. Always, always. Yeah, deferred consumption leads to savings. Savings leads to investment. Investment leads to capital accumulation. Okay? So savings comes from current income. And thus, savings is a central element. I'll get you a second, Sam. Savings is a central element to all economic growth. Because if we say that economic growth takes place because of accumulation, and accumulation takes place because of investment, then you have to have some level of savings in order to finance investment. Okay? That's why savings is so central to these models. Yes, Sam?
So how do you, and I understand that this is sort of the theoretical basis, but how do you deal with countries that don't have financial markets that are particularly effective?
That still have investment anyway?
Well, I mean, doesn't that sort of, in a way, change the whole savings investment model?
Absolutely. And we're going to spend a lot of time, particularly towards the end of the course, on institutions and talk about why, and theoretically, this is always the case, but how does savings get converted into investment? Just as you said, financial institutions, right? Financial institutions take pools of savings and use them to fund investment. Okay, that's something that tends not to be present in developing countries in the form that we've taken advantage of in the West. Okay, so that's absolutely a concern, but for the model we don't care about. We assume that savings translates very cleanly into investment. Okay, so therefore, sustaining economic growth requires both generating new investment and also ensuring that investment is productive. I.e., investment actually yields to capital stock accumulation, which then leads to greater growth. If you were to pay somebody to dig a hole and then fill it back up again, that would be considered an economic activity. That wouldn't be particularly productive in terms of increasing the amount of aggregate supply in an economy. So that's why many economists today look at China and wonder if all their investment in residential construction and commercial property is necessarily productive. So much of Chinese savings gets funneled through state-run banks into building large construction projects. So the question now is, have they overinvested in unproductive sectors? Okay? Now in the West we have things like markets to rein in these excesses. In a place like China it's a little less certain. Okay? So we'll talk about that later in the course. But savings is key, accumulation is key, and productivity growth is key. Okay? Now, given that, on to number 7 now, or excuse me, number 6, we can go to sources of growth analysis. Recall that factor accumulation and productivity gains are two core determinants of growth. Well, the question now is, how important are each of these in exploring growth? Well, we have a basic example of this, of growth accounting that your book goes over. We'll talk about it now. So, the basic growth accounting model claims that the growth rate in income for an economy, G sub y, is equal to the following. I'll write it down and explain the terms. Okay. The growth rate of an economy is determined by 5 things. The first, W sub k, is the share in total income that's paid to capital. It's a percentage. Okay? The percentage of total income that's paid to capital. Okay? G sub k is the growth rate in capital stock. W sub L is the percentage of total income paid to labor. Okay? Percentage of total income paid to labor, percentage of total income paid to capital, growth rate in the capital stock, and growth rate in the labor force. Okay? Think of this as a weighted average based on these two things. and we have term A. Term A is known as total factor productivity. If that term is positive, it's an increase, percentage increase in total factor productivity. That total factor productivity is considered our efficiency term. The greater increases in total factor productivity, ceteris paribus, or all other things equal, the greater growth we'll have in an economy.
Would you mind just repeating WL or?
Yeah, this is the percent of income paid to labor.
Okay.
Okay.
Income paid to labor.
Exactly. So we can do an example of this. So let's say that labor takes home 70% of all income in a certain economy. Therefore, it's equal to 0.7. Okay, so if 70% is paid to labor, what percentage is paid to capital?
0.3.
0.3. Furthermore, assume that the economy as a whole is growing at 4%. That capital stock is growing at 0.05%, or excuse me, 5%, and that the labor force is increasing at 1% a year. So the question is, what is the increase in total factor productivity? Well, doing this out, we can say that total factor productivity is 1.8% increase. Okay? In other words, total factor productivity is the residual. It is the amount of economic growth not explained by increases in the factors of production. That term residual is going to come up time and time again when we discuss solo. Okay?
You said it's not explained by factors of production.
By increases in the factors of production. Right? So take a look at this equation, yeah? See how we have two terms? Right? These are constants, right? The income taken home by labor and taken home by capital, that largely, empirically, just doesn't really change over time once economies hit a certain level of economic growth. So, assuming there's no total factor productivity increase, all increases in income can be explained by increases in the factors of production, right? Because Y is a function of capital and labor. Yet, if there's some amount of income that increases, that's unexplained by increases in the factors of production, we attribute that to increases in total factor productivity. Make sense? So this is a way, I'll get you a second. So this is a way of decomposing the difference between accumulation and productivity growth. Okay, question? Yeah, Win?
So how much labor increases seems like it'd be pretty easy to measure, with demographics and census and all that. But measuring capital seems a little more nebulous. First of all, you would have to go out and have a census of factories and machines and roads, and you would also have to value them in some kind of standardized way. It seems like how is that done?
That's very tough because so much. It's difficult to know the value of capital before it's deployed and actually put in the service. So the way we count investment in the United States, residential fixed investment is a portion of that, right? So our investment seemed a lot more productive in 2006 when home prices were rising than in 2008 when home prices had stagnated, and in 2009 when they had fallen quite precipitously. So you're right. We ignore that in this analysis though, for simplicity, okay? Good question. Anything else on this? The key takeaway here, the sources of growth analysis is one way of decomposing the relative effects of capital stock accumulation, right, this, versus increases in total factor productivity. That's the key, that's the upshot. Okay? Cool. Now, there are limits to this, of course. Total factor productivity is hard to disentangle. And it's a residual in the equation. It doesn't explain where increases in total factor productivity come from. It's exogenous. It just happens. But it doesn't say how is it that we increase the efficiency of the factors of production. It doesn't shed light onto that. Subsequent growth theories do. So you remember that piece by Skidelsky that was assigned for the preliminaries? All right, there are many economists who try to come up with growth models to explain these increases. So Lucas is an example of this. Okay? Okay. Now, in short, it's generally agreed upon that economic growth is highly dependent on capital accumulation in developing countries. Okay? So developing countries are dependent on this process. Okay? And increasing total factor productivity growth is the main factor of growth in developed countries. Because eventually, diminishing returns set in, and you need to innovate or have increases in total factor productivity to shift your total income line upwards. Okay? And of course, this is borne out. It should be no surprise given decreasing marginal returns to capital accumulation. So any questions on these models, how they fit in with the sources of growth analysis, the difference between total factor productivity and capital accumulation when countries rely on both of these? Is this clear? Great. What's that? Sort of? Okay. I'll take that. Yeah, question?
Just for the, I don't know, test purposes.
Sure.
The first graph is called capital stock accumulation.
This one right here?
No, the graph in general. You would name it as capital stock accumulation.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
What's the name of the other one?
This one? You can think of this as the equivalent of a exogenous increase in productivity. Yeah. It'll be a little clearer when we talk about the solo growth model. I think, you know.
But what is that diminishing marginal return on capital accumulation?
Exactly. So,
Is that it?
yes, subsequent equal increases in capital yield ever falling marginal amounts of output.
So it's the first one.
Yeah, although, I mean, that's displayed here too, right? This is just this is something we assume with our production function. It gives it the shape that it has. Okay?
Thank you.
Yep. Good question. Okay. So, moving along. Point 7. 5 characteristics of rapidly growing countries. Now, what is it that allows countries to take advantage of capital accumulation? To have capital accumulation in the first place, and then allow them to convert that accumulated capital into economic growth? Well, we've identified 5. The first is macroeconomic and political stability. We generally observe that countries with macroeconomic stability and political stability tend to grow faster than those countries without. Now, what's included in macroeconomic stability? Anybody? Yeah.
Inflation.
Inflation, that's a great one, right? If you have hyperinflation, it's very difficult for firms to make production decisions, very difficult for consumers to consumption smooth over time. Rapid and high inflation is a very bad thing and deleterious to growth, absolutely. Anybody else?
Sound
Yeah.
fiscal and monetary policy.
So what does that include?
Taxes that are reliable and.
So maybe predictable fiscal policy, taxes that are favorable to businesses, governments that don't binge borrow. From a monetary policy side, what might that include?
Federal Reserve or some other body.
Some type of central bank, sure. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, we're touching a lot here. So monetary stability encompasses a lot of things. The first is some sanctity of the domestic currency. Right? If they're just to print money ad infinitum, that could lead to hyperinflation, etc. The second is a functioning domestic banking system, which tends to depend on some lender of last resort. That lender of last resort is often the central bank. Okay, third, also a central bank that runs counter-cyclically to the broader economy. Now that's something we take for granted in this country, but even in our history, Nouriel Roubini has done a lot of great research on this. the concept of the political business cycle. Okay? How, in theory, right, who hates contractionary monetary policy? Who might disapprove of it? In a democracy, who might disapprove of it?
Congress.
Congress, people who depend on robust employment to get elected. Okay? Now, what does contractionary monetary policy often lead to? If the Federal Reserve were to raise interest rates tomorrow from near 0% to 15%, what might happen to business decisions, economic activity in this country?
Lending slows.
Lending would slow, and in turn, economic activity would slow. And when economic activity slows, usually unemployment goes up. Okay? So, the ability of a central bank to make these hard decisions is integral in providing monetary stability to an economy. This is very hard to execute in a developing country. You need institutional autonomy of a central bank. Right? So what do some countries do? Okay, some just print money, right? Zimbabwe is a good example of this. But what's an easy way to maintain monetary stability?
Dollarize?
Dollarize, exactly. Why don't you talk about dollarization? What is it?
Some countries just get rid of their own currency altogether and just use the dollar as their currency.
Very good. Panama is an example of this. Okay, I was in Panama for 6 hours on the layover. I was a good-sized student and knew they were dollarized, so I came with an extra $100, went inside the canal, and came back. It decreased transaction costs, and the monetary stability provided by dollars allowed me to take that nice little jaunt into Panama City. Dollarizing is the process of wholesale giving up of national monetary policy autonomy. Usually, it's to some reserve currency, which is the dollar. Now, why might dollarization be problematic? Now, the benefits should be clear, right? You import the monetary policy of another country. You have the Federal Reserve's discipline imported. That's good. Okay? Why might that be bad?
You have no control over that.
I'm sorry?
You have no control.
Okay, why is that bad?
Because there might be an instance where you want to print money and you can't.
Sure. So, exactly. In a good example... Oh, yeah, you have another?
And there's also political connection. Anything goes wrong in the main country, that affects. There's an effect.
Absolutely. If the United States just goes and we have QE3 that we announced, let's say, 2 months from now, up to QE57, Panama would import inflation from the United States. That's absolutely it. What else? Well, what does being part of a broader currency union depend on? Why is it that Texas and North Carolina have the same monetary policy? I'm sorry? Well, they're the same country too. That's kind of circular, right?
Same labor market, same.
Similar labor market, mobile factors of production across borders. But fundamentally, okay, this is something known as the optimum currency area analysis. If you come to sites, you take trades, optimum currency area. This won't be tested, it's just important. It's good to know. Countries with synced business cycles tend to be good candidates for monetary union. Countries where economic growth is highly correlated, right, tend to be good candidates for monetary policy union. Why is that?
Because they require the same kind of policy at the same time.
I'm sorry?
Because they require the same kind of policy at the same time.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So if Texas is going through a boom, there's a good chance that New Hampshire is partaking in such a boom. And so when the Fed raises interest rates because of that boom, it doesn't exacerbate any of the problems taking place elsewhere in the country, right? If Texas were to be going through a deep recession while the rest of the country is going through a deep boom, rising interest rates by the Federal Reserve would actually hurt Texas's position, right? And we can kind of see this dynamic arguably taking place in the European Union today, where there's been, some people claim, a fundamental divergence in the business cycles between so-called peripheral Europe and the core center countries, namely Germany. Okay? So that's monetary policy and fiscal policy stability. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really macroeconomics. But if you have any questions on it, we can talk about it. Okay? Another characteristic of a rapidly growing country, this is my second one. Macroeconomic political stability is one in total. Secondly, investment in health and education is usually accompanies rapid growth and leads to rapid growth. A healthy workforce is a productive workforce. An educated workforce is a productive workforce. Third, effective governance and institutions. Now this is confusing because we don't know where good institutions really come from. But generally speaking, we want market-creating institutions. We want market-regulating institutions. We want market-stabilizing institutions. You don't have to write out every single one of these down. Just think about what I'm saying and you'll remember it. And then you won't need to refer back to it. Or you can write it too, it's fine. Market-legitimizing institutions, and also political institutions. Administration of the central authority across the state. Those are things that are almost preconditions for economic growth.
So I guess I assume you were talking about political institutions the whole time, but you're talking about all kinds of institutions like universities.
Yeah, I mean all that. Maybe a good example of this. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, standard setting institutions across the country. So, the people who make widgets know that they fit into the machines elsewhere. That type of stuff. And also things like, antitrust institutions, like Department of Justice ensures we have a good rule of law and also prevents the consolidation of economic power in singular agencies. Fourthly, was there another question? No? Okay. Fourthly, we have favorable environment for private enterprise. A state that isn't predatory is one that tends to lead to greater economic growth. What do I mean by a predatory state? Well, one that on a whim confiscates the profits of various companies. Yeah?
Sorry, expropriation.
Yeah, expropriation is by far the biggest thing. Right? So, if expropriation is a big part of a predatory state, then having a strong property rights regime is important for creating the incentive structure necessary for private enterprise to thrive. Property rights. But where do property rights come from? Maybe the government does them. Maybe institutions reinforce them. Maybe it's just pure luck that property rights come about. It's difficult to just import them. So that's another big question. And finally, number 5, favorable geography and access to natural infrastructure tend to be a good determinant of economic growth, or one that will lead a country to grow very rapidly.
That last was natural infrastructure?
Natural infrastructure, yeah.
Natural resources.
Not necessarily. Natural resources, you could code it like that, but it's not so much just sitting on top of a ton of oil, but it's more being next to a global shipping lane, or in the case of Hong Kong, for instance, residing on a natural deep water port. That's what I mean by natural infrastructure. Why is it that temperature and economic growth tend to be negatively correlated? Yeah, I'm sorry, you had a question? The last part about natural infrastructure? The question, yeah. The question is, why is it that temperature and economic growth tend to be negatively correlated? Yeah, anybody read Guns, Germs, and Steel? Yeah, the answer is somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the machinery doesn't even work that well in certain climates.
Sure.
Take project finance, and it's like solar energy works in part of the world, but not others.
Mm-hmm. Good, so yeah, that's definitely part of it. What else? Yeah?
It adversely affects health.
Sure, in what respect?
Well, in the tropics, there's a much higher rate of diseases that, malaria that are related to the climate.
That's absolutely it. And there's a term for this. They're known as the disease curtain. I mean, have you guys ever heard this term? It's basically the notion that the tropics are very, historically anyway, have been largely inhospitable to large population centers and economic growth because, simply put, the ecosystems in tropical areas with high heat tend to be very conducive to bacteria, viruses, etc., which adversely affect the populations who live in them. Okay? It was really only until the advent of railroads that the tropics, non-coastal tropical regions, were able to penetrate into them and even colonize them. So favorable geography is a big part of it as well. Now these are all just symptoms, okay, of reasons why countries can grow. None of them is central or sufficient. I think that's the important point here. Simply having good geography doesn't guarantee growth if all the other factors aren't there. Okay? Oftentimes, it simply takes contingency in good leaders to lead to economic growth. This is controversial, but sometimes it depends on good colonizers. Historically speaking, colonialization led to certain institutions which may or may not have been conducive to economic growth. And there's a whole line of scholarship in political economy that explores this. Okay? Now, I want to revisit issue number 8 now, the notion of diminishing returns, because it illuminates this debate about convergence. Now, diminishing returns has several implications. The first major implication is that all other things equal, poor countries have the potential to grow more rapidly than rich countries. All other things equal, poor countries have the potential to grow much more rapidly than rich countries. Now, why is that the case? Well, because incremental early increases in capital stock tend to lead to faster economic growth than subsequent equal increases in capital stock, right? Diminishing returns. Secondly, the second implication, of course, is countries become richer then, is their per capita income goes up, their growth rate tends to slow. And related to those two points, since poor countries have the potential to grow faster, and rich countries' income growth tends to slow as they get richer, poor countries have the potential to catch up and close the gap in relative income. They have the potential to. Does that make sense? Poor countries can grow very quickly because they start from a very low point. Rich countries' growth slows down because of diminishing returns, and therefore poor countries have the potential to catch up and grow very quickly. That is the basis of this notion of convergence. Yeah, Sam.
Did you see that special that, what is that guy's name?
Fareed Zakaria? Yeah.
Yeah, he did a special on, I forget what show it is, but he had like a graphic representation of this whole concept of convergence, where you can sort of see over time the US and Europe and then all the other countries kind of catching up.
Interesting.
From Asia's.
Yeah, if you can find it on the internet, send it to me and I can spam it to the class. Yeah, that sounds interesting. Look, this debate, convergence is a fluid concept. The question is, what's converging? Okay, what's converging? Well, we have total national income. That's difficult for small countries to necessarily converge to large countries on. We have income per capita. And we also have the growth rates of both aggregate income and income per capita. There's aggregate income, income per capita, and the growth rates of each of them. There are different arguments to be made as to whether or not those things are converging with one another. Now, supporters and proponents of convergence point to Japan and South Korea. These are countries that started off very poor, imported capital quickly, grew fast, and have levels of per capita income largely congruent with the West. But in general, in an overwhelming majority of the world, we haven't seen convergence with rich countries on the basis of per capita income or even per capita income growth. Much of this course is dedicated to answering why we haven't seen that convergence. Now, in the final 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about growth and structural changes in an economy. And then I'll end with a brief point about next week. Number 9. Now, as growth proceeds over time, the structure of an economy tends to change in many important ways. As we stated on Tuesday, in general, the share of total income produced by agriculture falls as countries grow richer. The slice of the pie of agriculture diminishes. And related to that, the portion of the labor force engaged in agricultural production also goes down. Workers tend to leave agriculture, which is related to the third concept, that population centers spring up and the population in general becomes more urbanized as workers are freed from agricultural activities and in turn move to urban areas. Why do they move to urban areas? Largely because of economies of scale. The closer labor is to one another, the greater holders of capital can take advantage of that labor, have productivity gains, etc. Now, there are two principal reasons for why the fall in agriculture occurs. The first is something known as Engel's law. Which argues that as income rises, the proportion of income spent on food falls. And this is the key. Even if total spending on food increases. Total spending on food can increase as income goes up, but as a proportion of total spending, it falls. Secondly, productivity gains in agriculture free up workers that allow them to produce non-agricultural goods and services. With the importation of machinery, think tractors, factory farming, Western farming methods, etc., the capital to labor ratio rises, thus freeing up labor to go do other productive things.
Is that also part of Engel's law, or is that a separate?
That's a separate concept. Yeah. Thus, production moves to urban areas, and we tend to see urbanization as a part of economic development. Those are the primary early structural changes in the society. Okay. Now, any questions on that? Yeah.
Is there an opposite effect? I mean, the more workers you have living in the villages, how would it affect obviously the agriculture productivity?
The more workers living in villages?
Living in the villages.
Oh, leaving the villages, you're saying. The argument is that.
Is there an idea about this in development?
Well, maybe that the workers leaving the villages do so because they're maybe displaced by machinery, which allows the pre-existing workers to be more productive. And that displacement frees up resources to go pursue other endeavors, which tend to take place in urban centers. That's the sequencing involved.
I was looking at the urbanization from the perspective of what's happening right now in Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are living pretty much overseas to join the better middle markets, like in Russia or
Mm-hmm.
wherever. And villages are pretty much, losing their young 18 to 30 age population that should be helping and working in the fields, and that's really affecting the agricultural activity. I was talking about that. If there is no opposite effect from the economic perspective.
Yes, that's kind of related to this brain drain argument, I suppose. With free migration, capable members of the society go, they take up high-paying jobs, but as a result, they kind of leave a dearth of productive labor where they come from. And it seems like you illustrated this. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a problem with the theory. Yeah, no doubt about it. We'll talk about why, the difference in why cases can sometimes lead to this positive virtuous cycle of urbanization, greater agricultural productivity, greater income growth that we might have seen in a place like China versus the brain drain argument that you might see in Central Asia. Yeah. Yep.
I understand this argument actually mostly like implied for a particular country, not in general, when you look at the world in general, because that involves migration, of course, but when you look at one particular country, what you were saying, all this to do probably makes sense then. If in a certain country there is higher growth, that there is less population that is involved with agriculture. But of course, if you exclude the factors such as migration.
Yeah, that's fair. So maybe this makes sense in like a stylized case with a closed economy or limited labor flows. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So any more questions on this particular section? So what I want to do now is just speak briefly about where we're headed in the course. Now that we have kind of basis in terms of actual terms and things like that. And I want to talk about something known as modernization theory. Now there's a fantastic book by Nils Gilman about modernization theory in America. But is anybody doing the development certificate? Have you taken comparative national systems yet?
Yes.
Have you taken it?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. Have you covered modernization theory in it?
Yes.
Briefly.
It's
Okay.
mostly Gellner and Przorsky and.
Yeah. Okay, great. So modernization theory is this theory that kind of captured the minds of statesmen, namely in America, particularly after the Second World War. And it came out of this desire to have a countervailing narrative to Marxism. Now, why do we need a countervailing narrative to Marxism? Well, Marxism, or Soviet ideology, postulated that economic activity, political activity, and social activity were all united in a single dynamic. Okay? That economic changes led to fundamental political changes, which led to certain social changes in society. It's hyper-materialist, assumes a certain relationship among those factors, economic, political, and social. What modernization theory claims, it's quite similar insofar as it assumes that political development, economic development, and social development tend to be mutually reinforcing processes. So let's pick up from where we left in issue number 9. We have greater urbanization. What's the link between greater urbanization and political development? Anybody?
It reorganizes political constituencies in a given area.
Very good. So not only it reorganizes maybe old traditional ties, okay, but it creates a new urban middle class who, with economic growth, rising incomes, might demand greater political representation. So economic development could lead potentially to a greater political consciousness. And there's only a hop, skip, and a jump away from this notion to democratization. Do you see how modernization theory tried to be very cohesive? It claimed that economic development would weaken old social ties, okay? Breaking down traditional forms of association, namely kinship, clans, band society, etc. Create a more atomistic society or individualistic society, which, coupled with economic development, would lead to political development in democratic ways. That's modernization theory. The reason why we're bringing this up in an economics course is because many of the growth theories, including Solo's model that we're going to talk about on Tuesday, were largely integral in this broader narrative. That they depended on this narrative. Now, are there limitations to this argument? Absolutely. Okay, there's issues of cultural superiority, assuming that the rest of the world develops just like the West. There are issues of sequencing. And what I mean by that, it's related to the idea that economic development could lead to political decay. That economic development, if it happens fast enough, could lead to authoritarianism just as quickly as it could lead to democratization. And that social development, reactionary social forces, could impede economic development. You can think of this being maybe the expression of Islamism in present day Middle East and Central Asia. Okay? So modernization theory is the intellectual progenitor of growth. And that's why it's important. So if you want to learn more about the kind of epistemology of these theories, where they come from, why does they come from where they come from, take a look at Nils Gilman's book on modernization theory. It's called Mandarins of the Future. That's a great read. Okay? So, unfortunately, in a class like this, we're not going to be able to talk too much about political or social development, but certainly Francis Fukuyama, who used to teach at SAIS, new book on political order, which I'm currently in the middle of, is absolutely a fantastic read and complements this course very well. I'm happy to talk more about that outside the context of here. Okay? Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for today. And those of you who were not here 2 days ago, stick around. I have all the sheets and I can catch you up. And if you have any questions, stick around. Take a look at the Math Companion and preview the chapters this weekend. It will pay off handsomely when we have the lectures next week. Thank you. See you guys. Have a good weekend. Hi, so yeah, I have some handouts for you. Everybody get the articles we passed around? Okay. Take a look. Oh, you need them? Yeah, take a look at the GDP article. It's fantastic. Hey, so oh yeah, no worries. So you got the syllabus ready, right?
Yes.
Okay, so these are the Millennium Development Goals.
Okay, good.
So take a look at those and go for it.
Okay, sorry, can you just quickly, the Millennium Development Goal, HDI, what was it?
It's just another way of conceiving of development.
Okay.
Yeah. You weren't here on Tuesday, right? Okay, cool. I'll catch you up here. Step right up. Okay. So I gave you a syllabus already. Here are the Millennium Development Goals. There you go. Also, here are some articles we passed out. These are just for your own edification.